And we are live. Hey, rock stars. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Lid Shaw. Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. We have a wonderful live audio All-Stars Hangout going today. And this is funny because I'm trying to watch this at the same time on my laptop and an ad popped up. I was like, that's not me. But today is none other than Dynamic Range Day, created by Ian Shepherd of Production Advice UK and Meter Plugs. And this is actually the 10th anniversary of it. So let me get to introductions quickly. You can see, Rockstars, that we have some wonderful guests with us here today. I don't know if it's going to line up the same on your screens as mine. Let me see what I'm seeing down there. But I see, if I'm looking at what I think maybe everybody's seeing, on the left there is Mr. Matt Boudreau joining us from Working Class Audio. Matt, you want to say hi?
Well, hi, Lidge. Good morning, everybody.
Right on. All right. Hopefully that pops up on the screen. And then next up is, I'll go next to Chris Selim is joining us from Mixdown Online in Montreal. Chris, how are you?
Bonjour, Rockstars.
Bon matin.
There you go.
All right. And then we also have Chris Graham joining us from Chris Graham Mastering and from the Six Figure Home Studio podcast. Howdy, Chris. Oh, your audio is muted, brother. It must have just gotten muted. We're talking about extreme dynamic range here, Rockstars. All right, we'll give Chris a moment. He'll be back. Maybe you should jump off and rejoin. Maybe that's the ticket for that too. But and then we also have Ian Shepherd from Production Advice UK and Meter Plugs, and the founder of Dynamic Range Day. Ian, say hello.
Hi, everybody. And Lidge, just very quickly, I need to correct a tiny inaccuracy. This is not actually, strictly speaking, the 10th anniversary. It's the 10th Dynamic Range Day, but I think the 10th anniversary is next year. But anyway, it doesn't matter.
Oh, man, that's too complex for me. But you're as usual, you're right. Ian, would you like to jump in and just kind of introduce us to what Dynamic Range Day is and why we're here and what we would like to discuss today?
Yeah, sure. So Dynamic Range Day is an online event. Today, by the way, is also Piano Day, which I didn't know when I chose this Friday this year, but that's very appropriate because the piano is one of the most dynamic instruments there is. So I started it in either 2009 or 2010 to help raise awareness of the issue of the loudness wars. And probably most people watching this know about this already, but it's basically, over the years, music is being pushed up higher and higher and higher, closer to that digital ceiling that we have, in an attempt to make it kind of stand out from the competition and sound loud. But beyond a certain point, that gets counterproductive. There's not enough room for the music to breathe. You can't have any quiet without loud. And it's, so the whole kind of push for loudness becomes counterproductive, especially now that in the last 2, 3, 4 years, we've got the online streaming services using normalization, meaning they don't want to upset users by blasting them unexpectedly with loud music. So they turn the loudest stuff down to get a more consistent listening experience. And yeah, I mean, that's it basically. Was the idea that back when I started out, it was kind of fairly low on people's radar. I feel like these days people are much more aware of it. There's still a lot of misunderstanding about the issue, but yeah, people love the event. I've got a bit of a name for it, and I remember right in the early days. I mean, it all started when I was talking about Metallica's Death Magnetic album, and I remember saying to one of my colleagues, it's good that I'm getting all this attention for the blog and stuff, but I don't want to be the loudness guy. And I think at this point, I probably have to accept that I am the loudness guy, for better or for worse. Yeah, so that's the kind of the introduction. And I mean, I thought today it would be fun for us all to just jump on and talk about kind of our own experiences with loudness from different perspectives, because we have Chris, who's a mastering engineer like me, Chris Graham, I should say. We have you and Chris Selim, who are recording engineers, Matt, who's a recording engineer. Yeah, so I think I'm curious to know how loudness affects you guys, if it does at all. I spoke to Russell Cottier on a Facebook Live earlier this morning, which people can find in my Facebook stream if they want to watch it. He's a UK producer. and recording engineer. And, he was saying he's thinking about dynamic range from the performance onwards, basically, right? It's like you get the performance in terms of the way that the person plays or sings. If they have an instrument like a guitar or a bass or whatever, that's probably got some compression built in. So that's part of the mix. And then it's how hard does it hit the mic preamps? How hard does it hit the D2A converters? And it's just kind of rolling on from there. So yeah, I mean, that would be my first question to each of you is, do you think about this stuff? I mean, Chris Graham is going to say yes, because he's a mastering engineer. It's a huge part of what we do. But I mean, Lidge, do you think about dynamic range and loudness from the beginning, or does it kind of come in later in the process?
Well, yeah, no, I think it comes in for me later in the process. And actually hearing you talk about it, one of my first thoughts was thinking about a difference in generations of music makers too. So if you're older and you've been making music since before the live streaming or before the streaming music services, then loudness may have been all about participating in the loudness wars and trying to make things louder and louder. And then I'm curious, for people who are making it and all they've ever known is uploading it online, what does loudness mean to them? I imagine it probably means, making sure that your stuff just sounds great when it plays back off YouTube and Spotify and SoundCloud and everywhere else. But for me, loudness comes in it definitely comes in the production and the tracking stage as far as making decisions about the instrumentation. I remember T-Bone Burnett once had a great quote where he said, like, the sound of a great record is to turn the mic pre's way up and play as quietly as possible. And I thought that was really interesting and sort of enlightening for me. And I think there are a lot of great records where that's like a huge sound. And so thinking about that in the production stage, but then as you go through mixing, it's like, well, if you want something to be in your face and be competitive, what does that mean as far as compression and what's the right amount and what's too much? And I guarantee you, I've explored the hell out of too much before in my mixes. But then at the very end of the stage too, when it's up online, it's like trying to figure out if you upload your music and it's up against other tracks on the same streaming service, you want it to sound great. You don't want the other ones to sound amazing, and then it comes to yours and it sounds kind of weak and wimpy. But hey, let's also ask Chris Graham and just see if you got your mic working now, and maybe you can answer that question next, Chris. Oh no, we're still missing it. Dang it. All right. We'll figure it out. Hopefully it'll figure itself out. It's the internet after all. How about you, Chris Selim?
Yeah, loudness is kind of part of my workflow in a way when I mix. I always check my mixes with a limiter at on the mix bus that I bypass afterwards for sure. But I check once in a while just to make sure that everything sounds the way it should be. Apart from that, I would say when working with clients, this is something that used to come up a lot. Back when CDs were the main listening medium. People were always comparing their music with other products, with other CDs and stuff. And back then, remember if we're looking at the beginning of 2000s, masters were loud, like super loud. So that was always a struggle, always stuff to deal with the client when sending my mix to mastering and when getting the mastering back and have them listen to the master. And a lot of time I got the same response of it's too quiet. I listened to that Alanis Morissette song, it's like way louder, can I get it this way? But these days I would say that part of production since the streaming services that are up, it is way more, I would say. People don't pay attention that much as they used to when they were listening more on a CD than streaming. So, but I still.
Do you think that's because? Sorry, Chris. Do you think that's because you're kind of now doing everything louder as a response to what you did back in the day, or do you just think there's genuinely people are less concerned about it because it's less of an issue for them?
I think it's less of an issue. I actually have the same reflex. I remember I had Chris Graham last fall mastering an album, and I asked him, can you make this one just a tiny bit louder? Because I'm afraid my client is going to come back and tell me it's too quiet. I had the same reflex, but in the end, they never came back to tell me that it was too quiet. So we used the first version. So yeah, it doesn't happen a lot. Then a client's going to come back to me after I have you guys master a song that the master is too quiet. So I think people are starting to get used to the fact that masters are not that compressed and loud as they used to, which is a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good to hear, because that's my experience as a mastering engineer. And I think I heard that Chris's mic was working a minute ago, so I'm going to try him again in a second and see whether it's the same for him. But to kind of on the flip side of that, I'm part of a Facebook group of professional mastering engineers, and I get a lot of pushback there about the stuff that I'm saying about loudness and dynamics, because so many of them are still under so much pressure from their clients, the same pressures that you were talking about, back in the 90s, which is a real shame, because, and I suspect that's partly to do with the whole, a lot of them are doing a lot more work for major labels. And the thing about working for a major label is quite often you're not talking to the artist or the engineer directly. It's like often when I'm working on a mastering project, I'm working directly with the artist or directly with the producer or the engineer. So you can have these conversations and they're interested in listening. Whereas I think if you are talking to labels much more, this is my experience, you're talking to, there's people at different stages in the chain, and they have different ideas about what is necessary and what is required. And that the kind of the pressure then comes back onto the mastering engineer. Chris Graham, what's your experience about that?
Well, first of all, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. I demonstrated my competency as an audio engineer to
You could probably come down a little bit.
Okay.
Or actually, I can do that for you. You just go ahead, man.
Cool.
Get a little mixer here.
Well, yeah, it's a funny thing as a mastering engineer, because you do have that interaction where sometimes the artist will come back, and I think it's a type of imposter syndrome. Well, they will come back and want it louder because they want to be as loud as their heroes. And for a lot of artists, their heroes are people. It's a record that came out 10 years ago, or a record that came out 15 years ago at the height of the loudness wars. And so I think a lot of times, and it varies on genre. In heavier, music, it's that way. In electronic music, and it can be that way. In rap, it can be that way. But I think it's an intense thing where in some genres, it's totally over. In jazz, no one has ever asked me to make their jazz record, -10 LUFS or something like that. But in other genres, sometimes there is this, the artist gets nervous at the last minute that, I'm not going to be as loud as my heroes. And it's like, yeah, but that's a good thing. And so, Ian, I love what you've done to educate the public on this. There's been, I think, a really big change in the last year or two where all of a sudden my clients start the conversation with we're not into the loudness war thing. We don't want to, we use loudnesspenalty.com or something like that. So it's been cool since I met you a couple years ago to see a shift culturally where the message is getting out, man. People are hearing it, and that's a good thing for music.
Yeah, I mean that's great to hear, and I'm happy to accept the credit, but honestly, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that I've seen that change as well. This is number 10 for this event, and I've seen a change in the last few years in terms of the awareness out there, in terms of the reaction and the things that people ask for, and I think that's because YouTube, basically. I think YouTube and Spotify always had loudness normalization, but when YouTube switched that on, I think that was the big change. And then Spotify reduced the reference level that they use, which just means that everything got played a little bit quieter, closer to what YouTube does. That as well got a lot of attention. And I think I can accept some credit for having kind of talked about that on my blog and helped get the word out. But I think the reality is people are responding to the reality of the situation. It's right. Back in the day when Chris was talking about when it was on CDs, if your disc was in a CD changer in a bar or whatever, or you just plugged in a CD in the car and it wasn't as loud as the one before, that was the reality of what people experienced. These days, it's changed. Whatever it is, 80% of the listening is done online, and it's probably loudness managed, so that the loud stuff has been turned down. So
Yeah.
you know,
Do we really think 80? It's only 80%?
well, so the statistic I have, my new favorite statistic, is that in 2017, 87% of the revenue in the music industry in the US came from non-physical sources, so streaming and downloads.
Hmm.
So CDs, vinyl, cassettes, those physical formats only accounted for 13% of the money. So I
Right.
rounded 87% down, but it could well be much higher, you know. And
Yeah.
even so, I mean, that's a huge, and in particular, music discovery. I mean, I find all my new music now, you know, people say, "Hey, have you heard this?" And I go to YouTube or I go to Apple Music or wherever. So I think it's, and it's only going to, that was 2017, right? By 2019, who knows what the new percentage is, and it's only
Yeah.
going to go further in that direction.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think
Well-
as time goes on.
Let me jump in for just a second, make sure, because I know Matt may not have as much time as the rest of us to be here. Matt, what are your thoughts about loudness? And, you know, for me, even the concept of dynamic range is sort of a response to the loudness issue, but I've been thinking about loudness, and I'm sure you have. Do you have anything you want to jump in with?
Well, I do want to say that, you know, while Ian, you've done a great job at spreading the gospel of dynamic range across the land of pro audio and educating, you know, other engineers, I think really the key is educating the musicians to show that dynamic range can be in their best interest, because that insecurity of, well, my peers are louder, or this appears to be louder than mine, is always, you know, a struggle. Because, you know, recently I did a master for a group, and they replied back and said, "We love how it sounds, number one, and number two, we're just doing a little comparison to some streaming online, and it seems a little bit quieter." So there's a couple problems there. You don't know what method they're using to compare that, and so that leads to a lot of questions, that leads to a lot of speculation, and how to address that respectfully with the group is always an interesting tightrope to walk. Because at the end of the day, I will, you know, defer to them and say, "You want it louder? I'll make it louder." Because sometimes, truthfully, I just don't want to get into that "I'm going to give you an education" kind of condescending mentality. I would rather just say, "Yeah, let's just turn it up a little bit. You know, the services will push it down," and just try to make it as loud as they're happy with, as long as I feel that there's dynamic range intact. And if we get into the realm of ridiculousness, that's when I think I might become a little more aggressive with my sales pitch of dynamic range. But that's, you know, I don't know what you have to say about that, but I think we need to somehow show musicians that there's benefit to this.
Yeah, and there's a ton of great points in there. I mean, the one about how they're doing their comparisons is key. Partly because, I mean, overall, I think loudness normalization is a good thing, because it reduces the pressure for people to have to make their stuff stupid loud. But it is, you know, it's confusing right now. It's a bit of a mess. There's different procedures used on each of the streaming sites to figure out how loud things are going to be. They all have slightly different levels, and that's one of the reasons that Chris mentioned the loudness penalty site, which, by the way, I need to give him credit for, because he was part of the coming up with the idea of that in our group here. So kudos to Chris. But the idea of that site is that people can preview how their stuff is going to sound before it goes onto a streaming service. So you can just drag an audio file onto the site. It doesn't get uploaded. You'll get some numbers that will tell you how it's going to be affected, whether it's going to be turned down, and by how much. But then the other key thing there is there's a preview button. So, and you know, my hope is that people will start using that site, so that rather than people playing a file from who knows where, they could be playing it in an audio player that just has a slightly higher output gain or a slightly lower output gain than the streaming services, whatever that might be. If they use the site and they have the volume control on their browser right up and the volume control on Spotify or YouTube or whatever right up, they can hear a real world comparison. So that's the first thing, is that people need to be making kind of sensible or using a sensible process for comparing this stuff. But then the next thing is as I mentioned, the different streaming services do things differently. So for example, Spotify uses replay gain to decide how loud to play music back. And replay gain focuses very closely on the very loudest point of a song. So if you have a song that's generally quite quiet and then a really loud section, Spotify will notice the really loud section and use that to judge the overall loudness of the song. If that loud section gets turned back and everything else is a bit below that, people can end up feeling that the song overall is too quiet. So that's a real challenge. And you know, having said that, usually in my experience, when you get the balance right, you can get the best of both worlds. So that could be what's happening in this case, or maybe their comparison method is you know, kind of flawed in some way. But I mean, I just did a podcast episode actually about this strategy where I had a client who sent me stuff and said, oh, it's playing back too quietly on Spotify, and they had really big contrasts between the loud and the quiet sections, and I kind of listened to it and immediately felt, no, those contrasts are too big musically, right? And I suggested to them, well, why don't I have a go kind of reworking this for you and see how we go? And so I remastered the song just by ear, just to my taste. And I mean, I'm kind of pleased and slightly smug to say that when I tested that with loudness penalty, so the song was overall 1.5 dB quieter, but it played back 3 dBs louder on Spotify because of that balance that I had done between the loud and the quiet sections. So I think it's kind of, all of this is an opportunity and a challenge. And the shame about it is that I do see lots of people complaining about loudness normalization, kind of, you know, because it's so complicated and it doesn't work the way people expect, and they just get frustrated with it. So that's a real shame. And it doesn't mean that I think it's overall a bad thing, because, you know, the truth is we're at the cutting edge, right? This is all new. It's like the technology is only 2 or 3 years old in terms of the actual implementation, in terms of what we use. So everybody is on a learning curve. You know, I'm talking to some people from the streaming services who are like, well, you tell us the best way to do it and we'll try and make that happen. Well, not necessarily speak to me, but I mean AES groups and stuff where those conversations are happening.
Yeah. I wanted to I don't mean to interrupt, but I want to interject just really quickly before we lose this train of thought. You talk about how new these services are and how we're, you know, it's a work in progress. We're all trying to like quickly adapt, and the streaming services are what is, you know, that's kind of, it's like radio, really. It's a combination of combining the CD and the radio all in one. It's like everybody's going there to listen on demand.
Totally.
Many years ago, I'm going to say 1994, 95, I did this record with this band, and I did it all. I recorded it, mixed it, mastered it, and the mastering was an afterthought because we were like, well, we need to get this on CD, and I was quite new at the whole concept. So I actually just took one DAT machine and transferred it to another one via a chain of a couple analog pieces, an EQ and a compressor. We sent that in, the CD got done, it came back, and I was horrified at how quiet the CD turned out, because I wasn't experienced enough to understand. The side benefit is that I heard that CD played on college radio in San Francisco at the time, and it was shocking. It exploded out of the speakers because the radio compression and limiting just raised it up to this level where it sounded as powerful as anything on there, if not more powerful, because there was such an extreme dynamic range and the levels were so quiet. So that was like an early experience with dynamic range in CDs. Of course, things have changed since 1994.
Hey,
but
can I
they've
ask?
changed and they haven't changed. Go ahead, Ledge.
I was just going to say, I also wanted to go back to a thought. Matt, you sort of were defining the problem of interacting with your clients, and then they asked for it to be a little louder, and you sort of, not totally reluctantly, but a little bit like just said, okay, fine, I'm just going to push it up loud. Maybe you guys can clarify why the making it louder, maybe clarify why and how that's a problem.
Well, that kind of fits into what I was about to reply to Matt's comment, actually, because so he's absolutely right. I mean, FM radio has always used broadcast processing to get a loud signal, mainly so that people don't lose the station when they're in low areas where there's low signal strength. But they also use it to kind of put a station signature on the sound, if you like. So there's a whole kind of range of radio broadcasting processing gear, which means that Matt's quite right. You don't, there was always this myth of getting the radio ready sound back in the day, but actually within reason, almost if it sounded good as a mix when you put it out on the radio, it was going to sound good on air as well. That doesn't apply to online streaming services because they just turn things up and down. It's just a straight volume control. But there's still an element of truth in that, in the sense that, I don't know how loud Matt's master that he's talking about already was, and how loud the band are asking him to push it. But once you get past a certain point, there's just not enough room for the waveform to work in, basically. There's a trade-off, right? You've got this 0 dB full scale ceiling that the signal can't go above, and it's either going to clip, or you have to limit it, or you have to control it some way. And the more you push the kind of the overall loudness up against that, the less room it's got to work in. I always think, if you imagine a person on a trampoline who is the music bouncing up and down, and then you put them on a forklift and you lift the forklift, they're on a pallet, the forklift lifts them up towards the ceiling. As they start getting towards the ceiling, they're going to have to duck to avoid bouncing their head, right? And that's my crazy analogy for audio compression. And if you push it up far enough, they're going to be kind of like scrunched up and bent double and just sort of bobbing around like this. It's going to be ridiculous. Same thing applies to music, right? If it gets high enough, it's just not room for it to do what it needs to do to work. Now, it's a kind of spectrum in between those two, right? And for me, there's a sweet spot where you can get it right up there, and maybe you're tipping your head slightly when you get close to the top, but basically you can bounce on the trampoline, it's all good. If you go a bit beyond that, it's not like a disaster, but it's not a satisfying trampoline bounce. The music's not as satisfying. It hasn't got enough room to punch hard enough. If you're talking about the kick and the drums, there's not enough space for the choruses to lift in the same way. It all starts to sound kind of closed in and constricted. And the interesting thing is that you may not notice that straight away, because as you push it louder, it just sounds louder. You just think, well, it sounds better. But when it gets normalized, when the streaming service takes the louder one and turns it down, if you put two versions of the same thing on YouTube, one of them is kind of squashed and held in, and the other one has a bit more space to breathe and is kind of optimally balanced, that one will actually pop out at you more. It will sound better. If people want to hear this for themselves, check out, I've forgotten the name of the album, Janelle Monáe's latest album. Oh, Dirty Computer. Incredible album, especially if you're a bit of a Prince fan like me. But listen to that on YouTube, and then listen to it coming off of Apple Music, because the Apple Music version, I assume, is the same as the CD master, and it's about 3 or 4 dBs louder than the YouTube version. The YouTube version sounds incredible. The Apple Music version sounds incredible, but not quite as incredible for me. And there's an example of, I'm assuming, exactly the same mix, right? But they used one version of it for YouTube and decided on one level for it. And then the CD or the Apple Music version was pushed that bit harder. And for me, so people have accused me of saying, oh, nobody's ever going to hear that in the real world. But I actually put this album on to play to my son in the car when we were driving last week. And I just put on the Apple Music version, and it kind of got about 10 minutes in. I was like, I'm feeling really frustrated by this. It's just not, I'm not loving it. So I got him to pull up the YouTube version on streaming, and immediately it was like, oh, there it is. It's all back. And it's so, just like everything with what we do, you have a great performance, you have a great recording, you have a great mix, you have to have a great master, you have to get these balances right in order for the music to really sing. And if things get pushed too hard, it just doesn't work that way.
Hey, so Rockstars, I went and found a link to that video in YouTube and dropped it in the comments. So if that's the right one, hopefully it is, then you can just click on that later.
Gotta run, guys. Great to see all of you. Ian, thanks for all the stuff that you're doing with dynamic range and loudness penalties. So
awesome
pleasure,
to see you, Matt. Thanks for being here.
All right.
Hey, Rockstars, make sure you check out workingclassaudio.com. Go listen to Matt's podcast. It's amazing.
I've been saving this pun until Ian was done, but basically to sum up what he's saying is, if you're on a trampoline, it's more comfortable when you have some headroom.
There you go, man. I
can't believe I came up with that analogy and I didn't think of that joke. Thank you, Chris.
I like it. I was sort of imagining I'm in a closet and they just keep feeding me pizzas, and my limbs are sort of the peaks of my mix. And as I eat more pizza, my body keeps growing until there's no room for the limbs. But then that also implies that I want a really fat body to have a maybe that is a good analogy. Maybe if I ate too many pizzas, my mix just sounds like a big brick wall of mess.
Too many pizzas.
Oh man.
Oh,
Where's
sorry.
the donut analogy? Rockstars, you got to see Chris Graham's donut images of different mic patterns, and he'll have to come up with one for Dynamic Range Day.
My claim to fame.
It's probably like one of those twisted crullers or something.
It's about time I reshared that image. It's outstanding.
Thanks.
I actually think we probably came to a fairly good concluding point there. Do you think, in terms of our contributions? Because Chris and Matt have had to drop out. I don't know whether, do we want to head over and look at the comments and just see whether anybody has any questions?
Yeah. Yes, please. I'm glad you brought that up. So I wanted to give some shout outs too. Shout outs to Oliver, to Chris Cartier, and Chris Selim's already jumped back on the as a viewer too in the background. And Dan, Kevin, Envelis, Banked, and let's see who else in there. Blue Baggins, that's a cool name. I like that one. And goodness, Rob, welcome. Anyway, we got a bunch of folks on here, so awesome stuff. Can you guys see the comments as well to sort of pick out any questions you might want to answer, Ian?
Yeah, I'm just looking through now.
Rockstars, feel free to drop in a question for Ian right now, and we'll address that as best we can.
Or the other guys. I mean, it's...
Oliver has a question here. Hi, folks. I have a question for Ian. Could loudness penalty volume management... Could loudness penalty volume management be added to perception or dynameter to figure out what would happen compared to reference tracks for clients? Ian, that feels like a great lead-in for you.
Yes. I think, Oliver, possibly you need to watch the webcast this evening. In about 8.5 hours, I will be going live with the Dynamic Range Day evening webcast, and I will be announcing something that you might be interested in.
Very cool.
Can I say anything other than that now?
You say whatever you want, man. Also, I added a link to loudnesspenalty.com in the show, or in the comments there, Rockstars. So make sure to check that out later, and test it out because it's awesome. And you can just take whatever mixes you got, throw them up there, and see how they play back. See what they look like.
Kevin says, "What do you think of high resolution audio? Especially, does this have an impact on recording and mixing in the box?" Okay, so high resolution audio, you mean like high sample rates, 96 kilohertz, 192, and high bit depths. And this could be a whole other webinar, I think. But
get title.
The short version. They don't have to have a huge impact on dynamics. Okay. So to be honest, I kind of slightly regret calling this Dynamic Range Day. DRD, it's great, it's hooky, but we're not really talking about dynamic range. Strictly speaking, in a technical sense, the dynamic range is the difference between the loudest and the quietest signal, which in terms of CD is like maximum level, and the noise floor, which is 96 dB. Okay, that is, and when you think that most pop music, probably in terms of the louder and quieter sections, only occupies a range of 10 or 12 dBs, and even if you had something like folk or classical in it, you had genuine moments of real peace and quiet in there, the analog noise floor is probably only minus 60 dBs. So 96 dBs on CD is absolutely fine, and increasing that with 24-bit audio doesn't really, it gives you extra signal to noise ratio. It's an important part of the recording process because you can have the levels lower, so you don't have to worry about hiss. And it's theoretically possible, so why shouldn't we do it? But in terms of the maths that goes on inside computers, I think 24-bit or digital audio workstations use 32-bit floating point audio. It's a whole rabbit hole we don't need to go down. All of that is good, but in terms of the final delivery format, in terms of CD, there's plenty of dynamic range in a 16-bit audio file to capture all of that. In terms of the sample rate, again, higher sample rates don't really affect the dynamic range. They just affect the frequency response, the highest frequencies that we can record. And there are fierce debates out there about, what we can and can't hear. If you want to record up to 96 kilohertz, that's fine by me. I think beyond that there's pretty much guaranteed to be no point. and you probably are wasting processing power and pushing the technology further than it wants to go, especially unless it's super high-end stuff. But again, not really an impact on dynamic range. So one thing that I would say that kind of people might be interested in is that we're typically not even listening to CD audio these days. You know, the YouTube and Apple Music and Spotify, they're all using data compressed audio. Tidal is the only service offering lossless audio streaming these days, where you're getting all that full 16-bit or 24-bit range. That's not necessarily a problem in itself. Those codecs sound pretty good these days. But if you have super loud music going into the encoder, the encoding process will actually modify the waveforms, because I mean, remember, it's throwing away about 90% of the data and squeezing what's left into the remaining 10% to hopefully make it still sound good. That process completely changes the audio signal in terms of the waveform, and it actually generates peak levels that go 2 or 3 dBs higher than they were in the original. So if your original recording is maxed out, and especially if the loudness is pushed right up against that as well, you get a lot of extra waveform information, I'm going to say, because it's not really loudness, but it's just detail in the waveform in the decoded signal at the other end. And the problem is that that gets clipped almost straight away, even before they adjust the volume control. I think iTunes is the only one that adjusts the volume first. Everything else clips it straight away. So that's more damage. And what you will find is that if you encode super loud audio, it's not going to sound as good as something that was more tasteful, let's say. And actually, if you go to Spotify's website, they recommend that you don't peak above -1 when you're uploading your material. And if it's super loud material, you don't peak above -2, because the louder that it goes in, the harder it's pushed up against that limit to begin with, the more these problems become an issue, and the worse the encode is likely to sound.
Which site was that? Which site did you say that wants you the -1?
Spotify is recommending -1. I mean, actually,
I believe Apple does too.
iTunes also, the Mastered for iTunes recommendation is -1.
So what does that mean for us, Ian? So here we are mixing in our studio, and maybe we've got, like, one of these loudness, a loudness limiter plugin on there, and it gives us a ceiling setting. Does that mean we might want to pull the ceiling back to -1 and just have that as a starting point?
Yeah, I would recommend that personally. I mean, there are people who do masters that go right up to kind of almost 0, and then they just turn it down slightly a bit from before uploading to whatever streaming site. But I personally like one master to rule them all. I'm really Lord of the Rings about it. Even my CD masters these days peak no higher than -1. Because even if you release something on CD, it's going to get ripped. You know, people are going to put it on their iPod or their phone or whatever. I would advise at the point where you're, even if you don't call it mastering, at the point where you're kind of finalizing the version that's going to go out into the world, I would say don't peak any higher than -1. Having said that, if the loudness, it becomes more and more of a problem the higher the loudness goes. So I didn't know about any of this stuff 10 years ago. And I was mastering audio quite happily, and it was peaking right up to kind of -0.3 or something. But my loudness levels were reasonably conservative. They're not super loud like the ones today. When I play those CDs back and I do testing codes, there's the odd little peak that goes above 0 on the decode. It's not the end of the world. You know, it's not going to be a night and day difference. Whereas if you take something like Death Magnetic, which is also unbelievably almost 10 years ago now, it is more than 10 years ago, that's super, super loud, and it's peaking at 0 off the CD. So that's a bit of a disaster to encode. So my advice is the louder you're pushing it, the more careful you need to be about the peaks, the peak levels.
One of the things you can do that's really helpful with that is Apple has a plugin whose name is on the tip of my tongue. It's free, but it allows you to check for inner sample clipping. And what that means is essentially you can throw that on after your limiter and see if, we're going to get super nerdy here, but the reason you want to keep your limiter ceiling low is that despite what we think about a brick wall limiter is a brick wall, it's a little more like a brick wall with cracks in it. And there are transients that can sneak past that limiter. And by using this plugin from Apple, if you research the mastered for iTunes stuff, it's right in there. It's got little
round trip. It's called
round trip. Yeah, round trip. And what round trip? What it does is basically lets you know when this is converted to MP3 or AAC or whatever it's to be, is it going to have clips in between the samples? So if you imagine digital is a bunch of dots. So dot, 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 dot. I'm doing a waveform right here. When that gets converted to MP3, there's a chance that the encoding might get it wrong and change it a little bit when it's converted to MP3. And that one of those peaks, you can imagine there's the waveform goes like this, but the sample rate happens to fall on either side of that peak. So instead of like this, there's a dot on either side. When it gets converted to MP3, your limiter might see this as, yeah, it's limited, but when it's re-ripped to MP3, it might go way above 0. And so this plugin from Apple is really handy because you can check and make sure how much went past the limiter and would have created clipping once converted to MP3. So that can be really, really handy because there used to be like a lot of discussion about, is inner sample clipping a thing? And I used to be on the side of the fence where I was like, no, that's theoretical, it's fake. But as you begin to do these experiments and tests, it's a total thing. It really impacts the sound. And so just kind of paying attention to that. The inner sample clipping is the real problem, not necessarily the ceiling that you've set the limiter at. If you can do it so that there's no inner sample clipping at -0.1, which is challenging but possible on some songs, then go for it. But it's really about not getting that inner sample clip once it's converted to lower.
It's like if you took a crayon and you were doing follow the dots and you just kept going with the curve, you'd go from one sample to the next, but you'd go up and over and clip, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's essentially like a kid that doesn't totally connect the dots well. That's inner sample clipping and MP3 conversion.
Yeah,
Copyright lid
cool.
shot.
You're absolutely right, Chris. The cool thing about the Apple plugin is it's free, but you do need a Mac to run it. But there's other ways to do it. So Wavelab has a codec preview, and I think the latest version of Ozone has a codec preview thing. Sonox, I think, make a dedicated bit of software. So there's a bunch of ways. The other thing people can look out for is an intersample peak aware, either meter or limiter. Most DAWs these days will let you see what they're calling the true peaks. Okay, so it's not the sample peak, which is the dots that you're talking about, where there's this possibility that goes above the dots. It actually is it's effectively an oversampled meter, so that it can measure in between and figure out what's going to happen. And you're right, in theory, if you don't exceed, say, -0.1 with a true peak measurement, you should be okay in the encodes, but it's not an exact science, right? Because I mean, another thing that comes into this is the data rate. So iTunes uses 256 kilobits per second. If you have a piece of audio that is intersample peak clean at 256, it's probably going to be fine. But at 128, you might get some extra overs because
you're probably
the encoding is more aggressive, right? So it's kind of like the kid's hand is more shaky. There's more chance she's going to go over the dots. And I mean, like some of the mobile apps, I think use 64 kilobits per second, right? So if somebody's listening on earbuds, so my general rule of thumb is I would aim for -1 for what that's worth. We got a couple more questions. Yeah. I'll just jump in with the one from Envious Audio. I always export tracks for my clients that are sufficient for streaming services and then export a version for SoundCloud or personal use that's much louder. Is this the right way to go about this? So that's an interesting question, because SoundCloud is, I would say SoundCloud and Beatport are the two major places online that are not yet using normalization. I give you a sneak preview of a bit of good news I'm going to give away on the webinar tonight. Deezer now also uses normalization. That's only in the last few months that's happened. So that's another place where all of this stuff is kind of more sensible. But SoundCloud and Beatport don't. So the loudness war is still in full effect there. You know, if the main place that you release your music is SoundCloud, you're going to be up against this thing of people potentially judging your music as not sounding as good simply because it's quieter, which is a real shame. And I think I would say yes, Envious Audio. Your approach makes sense to do two versions. The only thing I would say is my personal version would be more dynamic, like for the streaming services. It depends how hard you have to push it for SoundCloud, but I hear people say they have to have their EDM tunes up at kind of -6 LUFS for the entire tune, which is insane. You know, it's like the Janelle Monáe album that I mentioned earlier. The difference we're talking, I think the YouTube version is kind of -11 and the CD is -8, maybe something. It's that kind of, I think at a -8 you can just about get away with it, but you push much higher than that and it's downhill all the way.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a sensible approach. You know, I mean, I kind of feel like even the people on SoundCloud deserve the better quality audio, and maybe we could all just start kind of not caring as much about the loudness. But I appreciate that that's easy for me to say when it's not my music that's being judged by people out there. So same thing applies to clubs.
I would add to this as well. And Envious Audio, aka Christian, I see you, bro. I know this guy. He's awesome. I would say with the SoundCloud thing, there's the temptation to look at today, to say, I'm going to put my music up. What's the impact today? And I think, Ian, what you're saying, and I think you're completely right, is we're only going to see more of what Spotify and YouTube have done. So to put a crappy master out there just to sound louder on SoundCloud can get tricky, because what happens when SoundCloud, like, you're going to wake up one day and SoundCloud's going to be doing this too. And now all of a sudden that master is not going to sound great anymore. So I think there is a responsibility for us as audio engineers to try to make timeless music and not just live in the moment.
Hey guys, let me jump in and throw another good question at you. This one came in from Henry Yoder, and while we're talking about -11 and stuff, his question says, so what is the ideal dynamic range? Is 12 dB enough? How would you guys like to respond to that?
So I don't advise people to aim for targets.
Amen. Thank you, Ian.
You hear lots of people, for example, saying, I mean, overall, YouTube is a bit louder, iTunes is a bit quieter, but you hear lots of people saying roughly -14 LUFS is the reference level that all of these services play back at. And if you master your music at roughly -14 LUFS, it won't get turned down too much and it won't sound too quiet on YouTube, and you're kind of in the right ballpark. That is true. However, what happens if you master your acoustic folk song, female singer-songwriter, at -14, and then you master a death metal track at -14? When those play back, they're going to sound the same loudness. So whichever way you look at it, either in comparison to the folk tune, the metal tune is going to sound ridiculously quiet, or in comparison to the metal tune, the folk tune is going to sound ridiculously loud. So aiming for any number doesn't make any sense to me.
I totally agree.
I mean, go on.
Oh, so I would say, like, the thing I like to preach to the clients I work with is the only number you should aim at is 12 goosebumps on your left arm. You want to evaluate it based on what serves the art the best, not some, like, there's this temptation for us as engineers to be like, numbers, science, when that's not what we're doing. We're making art. We're trying to get an emotional reaction from people, and that is extremely unscientific. So my joke of like measure goosebumps is good if you're doing that and trying to make the best art. If you're a good artist, you're probably going to find that you're doing exactly what you should do as far as loudness normalization.
It's a great point. And I love the goosebumps. I mean, personally, I go for 14 goosebumps, but I'm just a purist. So, however, those answers are not very helpful for people who are like, well, what the hell do I do then?
It's true. So, it's a frustrating response for sure.
So I'll try and give a more helpful response. What I do myself is have an idea of how loud the loudest moments on any given album are going to be. And I try and keep those pretty consistent. And I mean, there might be some point where the music is meant to sound like a black hole just exploded, and it's you creatively want it to be 10 times louder than anything else, perhaps. So that would be an exception. But if it's, a bunch of rock tunes, a good way for me that I find to think about it is to okay, so this is the loudest section of this song. This is the biggest song on the album. That's how loud I'm going to make it, and then judge everything else musically by it. If you've chosen your loudest point wisely so that it's not super crushed and you get the musical balances of everything else right, it'll all just work.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
if anybody is interested, my own personal rule of thumb is no louder than -10 LUFS at the loudest point.
That is exactly mine as well.
Great minds, you see.
There we go.
If you don't have an LUFS meter, a LUFS meter, then you could, then -10 RMS is about similar, or you could use a VU meter. It doesn't really matter how you measure it, and it doesn't even really matter what your numbers are. I mean, if you push louder than that, then you run the risk that your loudest sections, in my opinion, are going to start feeling held in and all the rest of it. But that's a question of taste. What I find when I do that is, so imagine, let's go back to my previous example. The death metal tune is probably hitting -10 LUFS the whole way through. So when you measure the integrated loudness, the overall value that people keep talking about for that, probably going to be sort of -10, -11, thereabouts. Whereas the folk tune probably only got up to -10 at that one bit where she really was singing her heart out, the final chorus, where she's strumming away. The rest of the song is going to be lower, and when you measure the overall value of that, you're going to come out at a value that's -14 or -16 or whatever. That's absolutely fine, because you don't want, I mean, YouTube and Tidal don't turn quiet stuff up anyway. So you can keep the balance between the loud stuff will get turned down a bit. The quiet stuff won't get turned up or down. It'll just kind of sit there. It'll work musically. It's all good. Something like Spotify that does turn the quiet sections up, if you listen to it in shuffle, the quiet song is still going to sound too loud. There's nothing you can do about that.
Right.
Tidal have spotted this problem, and they use album normalization all the time. So they will take, if you upload 10 songs, they will measure the loudest one, and that's what they use to decide the level of everything else. So everything else stays musically balanced, even when you're in shuffle. And that, to me, is the best system, and I hope everybody starts doing it that way. Basically, I mean, I've helped create dynameter and loudness penalty, which will give you numbers for these things. But I can use that rule, loudest points, -10, balance everything musically. I know that when I measure it, the loudness penalty on YouTube is going to be kind of 0 to -2, which I'm completely happy with.
Yeah.
It's going to look good in dynameter, so that's my more helpful example. You could choose to make your loudest section louder or your loudest section quieter, but if you follow that rule, I think you're going to be in good shape.
Well, so I was going to jump in and just make a comment from, listening to you guys talk. It is, you have an advanced understanding of what's going on with the technical aspects of this as mastering engineers. And many of us who are just, sort of in the mixing stage, and we're just trying to maybe finish one track and put it up there and make sure it sounds great. Maybe we're just writing and recording one song at a time and posting it, and we just want it to sound great or good enough against all these other tracks that are out there. What's cool about a tool like loudnesspenalty.com is that you can go take that track, put it on there, put it in preview mode, listen to the Spotify or the YouTube version, and then with a browser tab, go over to the track that you think it's going to be up against on Spotify or YouTube and listen to that. And it's like, I don't have to understand all this stuff. I can just trust my ear. Because, in the end, these responses we get back from bands that are like, hey, can you do this? Can you do that? They're just listening to it, and it either hits them or it doesn't. But I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about the perspective of how would you coach somebody like me, somebody who's just, writing, recording, putting up a song and wanting it to sound pretty good, maybe not at the advanced mastering stage. How would you coach somebody to get the most bang for their buck or use a tool like loudness penalty?
I think what you just described, I think you do what feels musically right to you. And then you drop it onto loudness penalty. And let's say if you're not pushing your mix super loud, then you could well get 2 dashes for YouTube, which means it's not being turned down, which means that it possibly could be louder. And you might get something like, I don't know, +2 or +3 for Spotify, okay, which says that Spotify actually thinks it's a bit quiet and it's going to turn it up. So you could then do an experiment where you just put a limiter, or if you already have a limiter, just wind the gain up by a couple of dBs on that song, re-export it, drop it back onto the loudness penalty website, and see what result you get. And if you kind of see a -0.5 dB or something on YouTube, and the Spotify has reduced to sort of 0, -1, -2, then your song is not going to be changed that much when it's uploaded online. And then, like you say, you just use the preview function to compare those two versions and make sure you're happy with the way they sound. And then you compare it with something else I mean, make sure it's something sensible. Like, if it's a folk tune that you're uploading, then compare it with another folk tune. But yeah, listen to it back off YouTube and use the Loudness Penalty website to preview it with the YouTube section selected and see how they sound. And if it sounds good to you, then you're good to go. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Yes. So it's a little bit like doing the car jam where you take your mix out to the car, you print it, then go out to the car, then listen to it. You're like, yeah, it sounds the way I hoped it would. Takes a couple of steps. Is there is there any way to kind of, I know that Dynameter lets us is one of the tools we can use, or do you have any suggestions for how to do this more in real time?
Hey guys, I gotta hop off. I've gotta go fix my kid's bike. Super excited about that.
All right, dude,
But,
great to have you here, man.
Let me throw sort of one thought in this. When Ian and I were first talking about this sort of loudness penalty idea, I think there's a temptation, and please weigh in here, Ian. I think there's a temptation for some people to look at that and think that loudness penalty is a target rather than a warning. And I sort of see like the LUFS thing as definitely more of a, you don't want the bells to start ringing and be like, too loud, as opposed to like, I want to get it right in the right spot. So I think I love the direction of this conversation of that great art is the ideal. That if your heart says yes, don't let your brain get in there and be like, and nerd out over it. We should be making decisions out of emotion.
I completely agree. And I think, I mean, for example, you mentioned you want the lights to go off, but I mean, if you upload your song and loudness penalties is -7, which means that Spotify is turning it down by 7 dBs. I mean, that to me it's a warning, like you say.
Yeah, but it might be irrelevant.
You don't have to do anything. It may be relevant. If you listen to it and it sounds great to you, and you listen to other stuff off Spotify to compare, and that sounds great too, you're good to go. There's no further action is needed.
Yeah.
For me personally, I feel like when I see a number like that, I kind of think, maybe that's a clue. Maybe that's an opportunity.
Bingo.
And what I find is I tend to do an experiment. And usually when I then compare the two versions, I prefer the one that was a bit quieter and gets a less aggressive score. But other people might disagree. And, at the end of the day, I mean, that's why we put the preview function on the site. And to answer Lidge's question, which is kind of the same, but what do we do if we're working on it in our DAW? I think anybody who's got to this point of the webcast deserves a sneak preview of what we're going to talk about tonight.
Well, and on that note too, I got to hop off, guys. Ian, thanks for everything you're doing. I think it's just so fantastic that there's a conversation around making great and better art as opposed to just how do I compare to other artists? That's Chris, a dead end conversation. So keep up the great work, man.
Thanks for being here, Chris.
Thanks for being here.
See you, Lidge. See you, Ian.
Cheers. And yeah, probably people guessed from what I said earlier on, but yes, tonight, you will be able to buy a loudness penalty plugin, which will just sit there in your DAW and measure these numbers for you live. You need to be a bit careful because if you want to get the overall value for a song, you have to measure the whole song. But you can start it off, you can see it playing, and then when it hits the loud section, you can see how the loudness penalty score reacts, and you can kind of say, well, okay, I'm happy with that, or I'm not. And you can preview it as well. So I'll be showing that briefly on the webcast tonight. But anybody who, and it'll be available on the meterplugs.com website as of tonight. So anybody who's interested in that, there is an introductory offer. We have made it super affordable, so you can get it today for $29 only. So hopefully that will help people. I mean, I completely agree with what Chris is saying. All of this stuff is just, we can't work by meters alone. It's all of this stuff that we've been talking about is a kind of a craft that I've learned over the 25 years of my career. And just in the last 10 years where I've been helping people to do this stuff themselves, they want guidelines. It's like, well, I can't just say, well, I just know, or it feels right, or whatever. It's like to go from not knowing how to do this stuff to being able to do this stuff, you just need some help along the way. And just like a frequency meter can help you get the right tonal balance in your song, see roughly whether you've got enough bass and treble and that kind of stuff. A loudness meter or something like loudness penalty can help you get a grip on all of these issues that we're talking about. But it's just guidelines, and it's like any of these meters, a LUFS meter or Dynameter or the new loudness penalty plugin. You have to kind of work with it and understand what it's telling you and figure out what that means for the music that you're working on.
Yeah, totally. And I'm definitely still trying to get a grip, so I'm glad that you're there to help me. Hey, is there? This might be too quick to spring this on you, but do you maybe have a link that we could throw in the comments here so that people can make sure that they've got that for joining your webinar later tonight?
Yes, dynamicrangeday.com. In fact, I will throw it in the comments now because
Okay, cool.
I should have made it /live. There is a button at the top of the site that says live, but I wasn't clever enough to make the URL live. So it is dynamic-range-day-2019. But that has
copy and paste that maybe.
Yeah, let me lost my comments window. Here we go.
Here comes Rockstars. Yeah, well, that's exciting news, Ian. That's super exciting. And I love that you've made this tool to help us, solve this problem. It's one of those problems that I think at first our gut tells us that we have it because we're comparing our music to other stuff we're hearing online. But then it takes a little bit of education to understand why we're having it and what it means and, how to sort of hit the right loudness and the right dynamic in our mixes and masters so that what we're creating sounds as good as we want it to.
It's the thing that I love about audio is it's creative and it's technical. It's I know there are musicians out there who just sing and strum guitars, and that's cool. They're sensational at it. And there are people out there who just do the engineering. But for me, mastering, and I think anywhere where you kind of get to do recording and mixing and all of these things, it's a blend of the two, and I just love that stuff. And yeah, all of this technical stuff is just kind of a helping hand to get your bearings, because with the CD you've got 96 dBs of dynamic range to play with. Which bit are you supposed to use? It's all of this stuff is tricky, so anything we can do to kind of help people come to grips with it, I think it's a good thing.
Well, so I'm looking at our comments in the live YouTube. Did you paste that link in by any chance? I saw that you mentioned YouTube. Is that supposed to be a clickable link? Link for everybody?
Two things above that. It says there's a link above where. So Ben says YouTube or Facebook, and then I've got a link dynamicrangeday.co.uk/. Tell you what, I'll paste the YouTube link directly as well.
Yeah, for some reason I'm not seeing it. I don't know why.
Huh. Strange.
It's always worth pasting it twice just in case. And I think we're coming up on a little over an hour. So Rockstars, thank you so much for joining us here on Recording Studio Rockstars for our I think actually our first ever audio Allstars Hangout. Hopefully I'll be able to do more of these with some of these great folks here, some great rock stars. And it's awesome to have you here. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking time out to watch this. Ian, thank you for being on this with us. Are there any closing words or anything you want to make sure the rock stars know about where they can find you and connect with you? I guess we'll have the link in the show notes there.
I was going to say, I've just pasted the YouTube link in the into the chat. Hopefully you guys can see that. But even if not, just find me on Facebook or Dynamic Range Day on Facebook. I will be posting a heads up later on about the webcast tonight. Please do. My website is productionadvice.co.uk, where there's a ton of stuff on all kinds of things related to recording, mixing, and mastering. But today the focus is dynamicrangeday.com. Please head over there. There's a button in the menu at the top called memes with some stuff that you might like to share if you kind of support what we're talking about and would like to help spread the word. Please share. I should have said at the beginning of this webcast, please share this video so that other people can watch the replay. And tell your friends, help get the word out. And if you can come along to the webinar tonight, I'll probably do another Q&A at the end of that. So if your question didn't get answered here, then maybe we can do it then.
Awesome. And then Rockstars, if you're in a different time zone or something, no, actually tonight is easy for us over here in the US for you. Your tonight is our afternoon. So that should be a breeze. Yeah,
it's going to be, what is it? We're 2:30 now. So it'll be literally 8 hours from now. But also if you click on that YouTube link, there will be a countdown that tells you the time in your part of the world as well. So,
okay, cool. And then Rockstars, if this is your first time here to Recording Studio Rockstars, it's a lot of rock stars. Hit the subscribe button and notification bell so that you don't miss any more videos from us here, and drop a comment in, which you've been doing. But if you're catching this afterwards, drop a comment in and we'll still come back and answer all those comments. If you have more questions about dynamic range day, loudness, whatever questions you have about that. Ian is the expert.
Hey, Lidge, I just want to say thank you so much for hosting this today, for letting me jump on and get all these cool guests together. It's been really good. I've loved it.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much, dude. Great to see you.
Cheers. Let's do it again.
Cheers.